Hello everyone and welcome. I am Luda Anastasievsky, the Programming Director and the Chair of the Holodomor Education Committee at the Ukrainian American Community Center here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm also a professional educator with over 25 years of teaching experience. It is an honor and a pleasure for the Ukrainian Center to be the co-organizers of today's webinar. For the past 2 years, the Ukrainian American Community Center has been participating in the Bridges of Memory program, a series of community dialogues and virtual educator workshops organized by the Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies. On behalf of the Ukrainian Center's Board of Directors and the entire Twin Cities Ukrainian community, I'd like to thank CHGS Director Alejandro Baer and Research and Outreach Coordinator Joe Eggers for the opportunity to share the story of Holodomor with educators and the public. Today we will be remembering and honoring the past, the victims of the Holodomor genocide, with the hope to transform the future. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian Minnesotans have contributed to the growth and success of our great state for over a century. Yet, their history, neither equitably represented nor drawn upon for important lessons on human rights in the Minnesota secondary schools. Moreover, currently, genocide studies are not part of Minnesota's social studies curriculum. This year, however, presents a unique opportunity because the Minnesota Department of Education is reviewing its social studies standards. It is the hope of the Ukrainian Center Holodomor Education Committee that Holodomor and other genocides will be included in the social studies courses in schools throughout the state. On behalf of the Ukrainian Center and our Minnesota Ukrainian community, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Valentina Kuryliw, the Director of Education at the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today and to share your valuable experience on teaching about the Holodomor in Canada. We're honored and excited to have you with us today.
Thank you, Luda. On behalf of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Joe Eggers, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Center. Tonight's event is the first, and as long as I've been around at the Center, event commemorating the Holodomor. A lot of credit goes to organizing tonight's event to Luda, and our Center is very proud of our strong relationship with the Ukrainian community in the Twin Cities. For more than 2 decades, the cornerstone of our Center's mission has been education, providing resources and information to give teachers the ability to instill lessons from difficult pasts. That's why I think I can speak for Luda too, am so pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Valentina Kuryliw. Valentina is the Director of Education at the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which includes researchers and staff across Canada and Ukraine. Valentina herself has been a teacher for more than 35 years, including serving as the Social Studies Department Head for Toronto Schools. In addition to her role at the HREC, Valentina serves as the chair of the National Holodomor Education Committee of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and a member of the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. Her book, Holodomor in Ukraine, 1932 to 1933, Learning Materials for Teachers and Students, was published in 2018. And with that, I'd like to welcome Valentina. Thank you.
I would like to thank Joe Eggers and his team at the Holocaust and Genocide Center at the University of Minnesota and the Education Committee of the Ukrainian American Community in Minneapolis, headed by Luda Anastasievsky, for their initiative to hold this year's commemoration of the Holodomor at the Center and to include the Holodomor in their programming. This is the second time I have been invited to speak at a Holocaust Center to commemorate the Holodomor. In 2016, I was invited to speak at the opening of a permanent Holodomor gallery at the Holocaust Museum in the city of Dnipro in eastern Ukraine. Therefore, thank you for inviting me to participate today. I would like to extend a welcome to all fellow educators, community leaders, and those of you who are interested in the Holodomor. I was asked to cover some basic facts about the Holodomor for the general public, and then to talk about what steps I took to include the teaching of the topic of the Holodomor in schools in Canada. Since Ukraine's independence, November is the month that was chosen to commemorate the Ukrainian genocide worldwide, specifically on the fourth Saturday in November. This year marks the 87th year since the Holodomor. And even today, few people know of this horrific genocide that was engineered by Joseph Stalin and his communist regime in the 1930s that wiped out millions of victims inside Ukraine and the Kuban region, an area adjacent to Ukraine with a large Ukrainian population. Food was used as a weapon during the Holodomor. 31% of the victims were children under the age of 10. Despite these facts, the Holodomor denial is still with us today. This is in Ottawa, Canada, the capital of Canada. It is the Tribute to Liberty Memorial Monument to the victims of communism in the nation's capital, which was vandalized on July the 1st, Canada Day, this summer. And Canada Day on July the 1st is a national holiday in Canada, similar to your July the 4th. This is another memorial. It is called The Bitter Memory of Childhood at the National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide in Kyiv, Ukraine, which was vandalized on August the 21st of this year, a couple of days before the celebration of Ukraine's independence this summer. Genocide and Holodomor denial are still prevalent in different parts of the world. So what was my motivation to devote my retirement years to getting the Holodomor into the curriculum? As an educator and history specialist, I felt I had an obligation to take on the task of bringing greater awareness to the Holodomor and to include the topic in the Canadian curricula with which I was familiar. But my motivation was my parents and their friends who had survived the Holodomor and Soviet concentration camps and had told me about it. Of course, I also felt their pain. And this is my father and my mother who have since passed. These are photos of them in their early years. At the time of the Holodomor, my father Ivan was 21 years old and in 1932 had just been released from the Belomor concentration camp that Stalin had organized. And Nadia was 11 years old at the time. This is a picture of her when she's a bit older, and she was going to a Ukrainian school in the city of Ichnya in the Chernihiv Oblast. So I would like to introduce the topic by showing you a video interview with me as a child of Holodomor survivors. It comes from, as you can see, chapter 5 of Voices into Action, which was produced by FAST, which stands for Fighting Anti-Semitism Together, is an organization that has produced online teaching resources on genocides with lesson plans. This is the video. There it is.
Holodomor is a word that comes from two Ukrainian words. One is holod means starvation or famine, and the second one, morete, means to torturously put to death. The definition is death inflicted by starvation, and it's a man-made famine. Created by the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian genocide, known as the Holodomor, started in 1928, and it came to a crisis in 1932-33. It was about 4 million men, women, and children died because of starvation, because of man-made famine, the Holodomor. Stalin, he was a dictator. He came to power and he decided that he was going to make the Soviet Union into a very important state. And he wanted to build a very strong army because he was interested in spreading communism around the world. The Ukraine was conquered by the Soviet Red Army. And the Ukrainians who had tried to set up their own country for a while were now under what we call the Soviet Empire. The Soviet Union tried to control the Ukrainian population, which was not keen on communism. They also felt that they had to take over this land and the property of all these farmers. Now, it's not buying them out. It's a question of taking it. They had to take the grain away from the Ukrainian people and to ship it out overseas. They even took the seed grain, which is used for planting the new crop for the following year. They took away all the grain and all the reserves, so there was nothing to make bread out of. They took away all food, pumpkins, apples, anything that was edible. The family lived just on the outskirts of the city of Kyiv, which is the capital city of Ukraine. They were prominent farmers. My grandfather was arrested in 1929, at the beginning of 1929, as a kulak. A kulak is a rich peasant, as they call them. Stalin's policy at the very beginning was to arrest these farmers. They sent in a group of people from the secret police. It was called the GPU. They took him to prison and just came and just took him forcibly, and he was put into Gulag. He died in 1937 in prison. My grandmother, who was still living in the house, the family home in the village, a group of people, again, from the GPU and maybe some locals came in, and they threw her out of the house with just what she had on, 20 below, in January, and with her 5 children, because my father was not there at that time. They threw them out on the street, and they warned anybody who would help them that they would get the same kind of treatment. So some neighbor in the area did allow them to live in her barn for the winter. A little bit of everything they owned, the implements, the machinery, the livestock, their household items, their clothing, everything was going to be auctioned and given away. So they were just thrown out. They were garbage, basically, the scum of the earth. It was being done on a massive scale. There were about 1.5 million people, men, women, and children, who were affected. Most of them ended up in Siberia. Some were executed, and some went to the Gulag. And my father, in 1930, was arrested as the son of a Gulag. The Gulag is the Soviet concentration camp. So they were the first ones to suffer. One of the things Stalin did was he brought in something called collectivization, which means that all private property that existed would now become state property owned by the government. And that means that you had to dispossess or take away the farmers' land and everything they owned and make them into employees of the state and work on what is called a collective farm, a kolkhoz, instead of having their own farms. For the Ukrainians, this was a complete disaster. The collective farm had to meet a grain quota. In other words, they had to produce so many bushels of wheat. Well, the quotas were so high that none of the collective farms could meet them. And because they didn't believe that there wasn't enough grain, or they felt the Ukrainian farmers had kept grain for themselves to feed themselves in the winter, they started going from household to household with these big steel rods, digging in the ground, looking for things, for grain. And if they found some, the farmer was arrested immediately, shot on the spot, or sent to the Gulag. If a collective farm did not produce enough grain, they were labeled as being resistors. So they were blacklisted, and 1/3 of all the villages of Ukraine were blacklisted, which meant you got no supplies and you could not go anywhere to get any food. So that you were virtually surrounded by troops and you were left to die. Most of the people, when they were thrown out of their homes, if they had relatives somewhere else, they would go and try to live with them. Some of them tried to go to the cities. The Soviets passed a law that you had to have a passport to travel. You could not leave your village. And to buy a train ticket, you had to have a passport. This was like an internal passport that you have. And so you couldn't get onto a train. So what happened is sometimes families who knew that they couldn't fend for their children, where the children are thrown onto a railway card where kids are thrown hoping that somebody will find these kids and feed them. So the kids became orphans, running around the cities looking for food. People who did end up in the cities were begging on the streets, and they were usually arrested and sent back to where they came from or anywhere outside the cities. In 1933, there were bodies all over the streets in the cities as well. And the people in the cities found it difficult to help because they themselves were on rations for food. There were lots of people starving and dying. There was even cannibalism, as you can well imagine. It takes about, they say, between 3 to 4 months for a person to die of starvation. So that's a very torturous death. It's a horrendous way to die. It's easier to be killed with a bullet. My mother's family lived in a small city in Ukraine. They also had a distillery in the city. A distillery requires grain to make alcohol. For this distillery, they had enough grain. My grandmother, she said there were mounds and mounds of grain, guys with guns standing around to make sure that none of the hungry people could get to this grain. She said that at the end of the fermentation process, when there was the leftovers, the chaff from the grain was thrown into a huge, huge pit. And she said people lined the outlines of this pit. She says some of them fell into it and drowned. She would walk to that pit. She would fill the pit with the garbage that was there. She would bring it home. She would wash it. She would grind it. She would dry it. And she would make some kind of bread. That's one of the reasons why they survived. The world was basically silent. The journalists were stationed in Moscow, which is quite a distance away. They were not supposed to be traveling. They were told not to leave. But some of them did dare to do it. And some of them went through Ukraine. And they saw with their own eyes what was happening. Others played along with the Soviet authorities. Walter Durante, for example, of the New York Times, who basically said that there really is no famine. There is malnutrition, and there is some people are hungry, but it's not a starvation. He said that for the New York Times, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. But there were others who did dare. Malcolm Muggeridge was one from the Manchester Guardian, a Brit. And there was a Canadian, Rhea Kleiman, who was a Canadian journalist. She was Jewish. She went on a car tour with another American, and they saw these things and they wrote about them. But very few people wanted to do anything. What are you going to do about it? It's an internal problem of the Soviet Union. Canada was the first Western country to acknowledge the Holodomor as a genocide. It's important for students to see that there is a process in how a genocide is conducted. It starts off with your first thing like bullying against one individual, one little group. It escalates to a larger group. Eventually the government gets involved. And if you have the government involved in doing that and dehumanizing a segment of the population, you'll find that it becomes a complete catastrophe. And that's how things happen. And it can happen to you if you sit and do nothing about it. Heroism means that you take a stand, even when nobody else is willing to support you, but you decide that you're going to do the right thing. And so someone like Rhea Kleiman, who had views at one point that were quite different, saw the reality of what was happening in Soviet Ukraine and decided to write about it and to tell the world that this is not what they believed it was. That was all propaganda. And the same thing with the farmer, with the farmer who actually let my grandmother in with her small brood of children into his barn so that they could survive for the winter and probably fed them to some extent with whatever meager supplies they had. That decided that this woman has done nothing to get this kind of treatment, and she's a human being. She needs to be helped. We see changes in the world. We see changes in what's happening in Europe. We see changes even in the United States. And we know that things can happen overnight. A political system can change, a person can change, and even the democracy that we have can be in danger. We have to speak out. We can't be quiet bystanders. Overnight, we can lose what we have.
This is a certificate of achievement in Soviet schools in the 1930s. I thought it would be of interest. And it's a good example of how totalitarianism affects every aspect of life in society, especially education. How would you feel about getting a report card with Trump's or Biden's photo on it? This is a photograph I received recently of my grandparents on my father's side, Tatiana and Karpo Mikhailovsky. Recently, I visited the former KGB headquarters in Kyiv to get my grandfather's arrest and interrogation papers. You see, 3 generations of my family were incarcerated in the 1930s, and 2 of them died as a result in Ukraine. My cousins in Ukraine know little about their grandfather, as their parents were afraid to tell them anything about it, should they speak about their past. So I dug for this information. And I found out that Karpo was arrested in 1928, not 1929, actually in November. He was labeled as the son he was a kulak. He owned a small store and a bit of land. And later he bought a mill with a cousin or 2. He came from a prominent family in the large village. In other words, they were the leadership of the village. Just outside of the city of Kyiv. He and a group opposed communism and collectivization. They posted flyers against joining the kolhosps, and they burnt down the home of a communist activist who was promoting collectivization. As a result, he died in prison in 1937. He was labeled as an anti-Soviet element and was part of a group that was demonized by Soviet propaganda. My great-grandfather, his father, was arrested in 1937 at the age of 77 and died soon after in Siberia. Today, this man I have never met is a hero in my eyes. Again, this is the family home of a great aunt in Ukraine. Both my parents survived the Holodomor, and they lived in Ukraine and were there during World War II. Both parents were sent to Germany by the Nazis occupying Ukraine to work in their factories, as they had most of their men in the army. And they met in Olympia, in the city of Erfurt, a typewriter factory that had armaments in the back. My father was a typewriter mechanic. Both parents, therefore, were Ostarbeiters. By the grace of God, once more, this time they survived the Nazis, and my mother a Gestapo prison. This is a picture of a kindergarten that I belonged to, that I attended in a refugee camp, where there remained mostly Ukrainians in this refugee camp after the war, where I was born. I'm in the center of the photo. So what are the basic facts about the Holodomor? First of all, what it is. It's death inflicted by starvation, the Ukrainian genocide. When did it occur? In 1932 to 33, I should say. At the height of the famine in June of 1933, 28,000 people a day were dying of starvation. And so who were the perpetrators? The Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin, and the victims were the population of Ukraine. And where did this take place? In Soviet Ukraine and the Kuban region, as I have mentioned already. So how was this done? By issuing Soviet policies and laws passed that created the conditions that led to starvation. The limited mobility of farmers, who had to have an internal passport to travel to another town with no possibility of getting a railway ticket, had to search for food. The borders of Ukraine were sealed. No one was allowed out to go to Russia where food was available. The high quotas were set for grain were impossible to meet. And as was mentioned, 1/3 of the villages were blacklisted because these were renegade villages. They were surrounded by troops, and this was a death sentence to them. And of course, also, I wanted to mention the law of 5 stalks of grain. This was a law passed that anybody who was gleaning or picking up even 5 stalks of grain could be executed on the spot or receive a sentence of 10 years in prison, even children, for stealing socialist grain from the fields. So why were the Ukrainians targeted as a group by the Soviet regime? Why did so many die? Well, first of all, because Ukrainians resisted communism and collectivization. There were many revolts. Even though Ukrainians made up only 20% of the population in the Soviet Union, they had 50% of the revolts were in Ukraine at that time. Ukrainians had tried to set up an independent Ukraine. So the fear of losing Ukraine, which is found in quite a few secret documents that were sent by Stalin to Kaganovich, to Molotov, etc., are evidence of that. Because Ukrainians resisted communism and they wanted to have their own state. And of course, food was used as a weapon in two major ways. The requisition of all grain, even seed grain, to sell abroad. And of course, Ukrainians were left to starve. And secondly, the removal of all food from over 1/3 of the villages who did not meet the quota set by Moscow, which left them nothing to eat. The Soviets also destroyed the intelligentsia in the early 1930s, that is the religious, cultural, and political leadership of Ukraine. So how can a genocide be forgotten by the country that suffered it, as well as the rest of the world? Because it was denied, covered up, and ignored for over 5 decades. History inside the Soviet Union was officially rewritten, and it excluded any mention of the Holodomor. As a matter of fact, it was forbidden to mention it anywhere, and grandmothers were afraid to share any of their experiences with their grandchildren for fear that they would say something at school and then the whole family would disappear. So there was a loss of historical memory. So denied by whom? By the Soviet, by the Soviet Union, right up to its demise, and Russia to this day, covered up by Western journalists like Duranty and socialist sympathizers during the 1930s, and ignored by Western governments. So what is being done to teach it? And how are we doing it? Well, it started with, in Canada, it started with initiatives in various cities like Toronto, where we had a large Ukrainian population. In 2008, I suggested the creation of the National Holodomor Education Committee to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress to set up a separate committee that dealt exclusively with education, because we already had an awareness committee. And it required educators as well as activists. And then, of course, we set up local Holodomor education committees in the various provinces across Canada, which are 10 and 3 territories, to coordinate our activities and to share our resources. So the second thing that had to be done was you had to have recognition of the Holodomor as a genocide. This is a must in order to get it into curriculum in the various provinces. So I think it's the same thing with your various states. And to set up an annual day of commemoration as well. In Canada, that occurred in 2008 when President Yushchenko of Ukraine visited Canada. And today there are 6 provinces that have recognized the Holodomor and have an annual day of commemoration. So once the Holodomor was formally recognized, commemorations were held by local communities. But what about the schools? That, after all, Holodomor awareness through education is extremely important. So we set up a Holodomor Memorial Day in schools, which happens to be the 4th Friday in November. As you know, we don't go to school on Saturdays, except to Ukrainian school occasionally. The Toronto District School Board is the 4th largest school board in all of North America. The population of Toronto is about 3 million. And each year, we remind schools about the coming event, the Memorial Day, by preparing a pamphlet, a letter, and send a specialized email with links to all kinds of teaching resources. And of course, they always light candles in commemoration, even virtual candles in school. This is the pamphlet that we prepare. As you can see, there are basic facts about the Holodomor. There is even a Memorial Day announcement that can be read over the PA. And then we have resources, films, websites, and workshops. And of course, books that are there, and my book is there at the top. And we have a bus that has a lesson on the Holodomor as well, a memorial to the victims of the Holodomor that was just launched last year. And of course, we try to, we have a Holodomor Educator Award as well, which we promote. Next. So the inclusion of the Holodomor as a topic in official curriculum across Canada was something we needed to do. For this, we need professional educators who know the curriculum. So what is our approach? What works best in education? You have to emphasize the issues that are important in our society and must be taught. So the issue of human rights, their abuse, democratic values that we all share and teach, and responsible citizenship, which may be taught in many courses and grades in the curriculum. These which have to be identified in which curriculum they could be taught. I started to teach the Holodomor in history classes from a historian's point of view, as a historian. History is an elective subject, unfortunately, in Canada, and I'm sure here too. A number of years ago, Joyce Apsel, a professor who teaches genocide studies in New York City University, suggested I teach the Holodomor through the human rights point of view. Immediately, it opened up all kinds of possibilities. This was especially true when I was teaching in Ukraine, as they are trying to reform their education system and are trying to reflect Western values. So this approach made it possible to have a multidisciplinary approach, to include the topic of the Holodomor, not just in history courses, but in many other subjects as well. It is thus a multidisciplinary approach in Ontario that the Holodomor today may be taught in 22 out of 27 history and social studies courses, such as world issues, geography, politics, law, literature, art, media studies, genocide, and so forth. So how do we get teachers to teach the Holodomor? For me, methodology is king in education. Teaching strategies that are innovative, engaging, interactive, interesting, creative, and current. Today, a teacher is not a trainer teaching kids to memorize facts, but an organizer and facilitator of the learning process. So you need professional educators with current methodologies to entice other teachers to want to teach their lessons. The delivery method of the teaching resources is just as important as the resources themselves. An example I want to give you is the historian's craft lesson on the Holodomor that I authored. Today, the emphasis is on developing critical and historical thinking skills, not just facts. You need an excellent lesson plan that captivates students. That means interactive methods, some analysis, synthesizing, and allowing students to reach to their own conclusions. My approach is for students to work like historians or detectives to find the truth using a variety of resources that I give them. In such an approach, little material about the topic is given to them ahead of time because they have to come to their own conclusions while working in groups and they have to teach these conclusions to each other by presenting to the class. This is interactive learning at its best. The role of the teacher changes from a provider of information to that of one who organizes and facilitates the learning process. As a result, HREC was born. You know, volunteerism up to that point that I've been talking about is not enough. Enthusiasm is great, but you need funding as well to sustain your initiatives. So the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, short form HREC, was founded in 2013, as we were told, a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. It was a dream of mine made possible by the support of James Temurte and the Temurte Foundation, a Ukrainian Canadian businessman and a close friend. HREC deals strictly with the teaching of the Holodomor and researching of it, and has two equal branches, research and education. Research works with universities globally on developing research and holding presentations, conferences, and publishing. HREC education has as its main components are resource development, educator training workshops, presentations, outreach, consulting, and promotion. We work with ministers of education in each province across the country. It takes all of these different pathways which support each other and integrate with each other to get the Holodomor into education. These are some of our Holodomor education initiatives within HREC. As you can see, there are quite a few, and I will be dealing with some of them in more detail. There's some more, as you can see. So one of them is advocacy. We have a partnership agreement with the Toronto District School Board, and here you can see Dr. John Malloy, who is the Director of Education. They were the first to pass a resolution declaring Holodomor Memorial Day in their schools, which then blossomed to other areas and across the country, and have a genocide course in 13 of their high schools, and we are trying to get it into every school. We were thus accepted as an accepted educational partner and recommended and listed for teachers to invite to classes to give presentations, which was a great step. Classroom visits. This is from Bishop Allen Catholic High School. And last year, on Holodomor Memorial Day, I was invited to speak at an assembly at the George S. Henry Academy in Toronto that was organized by the students on the Holodomor for grades 11 and 12. Students prepared the entire assembly. They researched information. They even researched traditional Ukrainian music so that there could be something solemn, and they did an exhibit as well. And of course, we prepared handouts for the school and a Holodomor education kit for the school library, so that we provided them with teaching materials, a book of primary documents, a DVD, the pamphlet, and my top picks list of resources that they could use. Next. That's right. So, and teacher training workshops are extremely important if we want to teach the Holodomor. The Toronto District School Board, Professional Development Day trainings. This was very important. And again, the Holodomor kit was given out to each of the schools that attended. The second one that you see is at the California State University in Fresno at their Faculty of Education, which was a training for their teachers who were working like students to analyze, synthesize, and reach their own understanding of the Holodomor using the resources each group receives. Everywhere I conduct workshops, we leave resources with teachers. Another initiative that I wanted to mention was a student writing competition on the Holodomor, which we expanded to doing videos as well, which is open to all high school students. And these were two of the student winners. And as you can see, not all of them were Ukrainian. And something that I'm extremely proud of is our HREC Educator Award for Holodomor Lesson Plan Development in North America. Notice the North America. To encourage educators to develop lesson plans on the Holodomor and to reward teaching excellence. It is an annual event And the next deadline for submissions is May the 1st, 2021. And all the information is on our website, how to apply for it. These are the winners of the 2020. As you can see, one is an American from New Jersey, the other an elementary school teacher from Edmonton, Alberta. These winning lessons that they provided us are available to you on our website under Learning Activities. They receive a monetary prize up to $2,000 Canadian and a certificate as a HREC educator. The details of this award are available on our website. Another initiative I'm pleased to share with you is the National Holodomor Education Conferences we held. The first one was in 2013 in Toronto, and this one is in 2017 at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, and invited participants also from the USA and Ukraine. There were 120 participants, from professors who were keynote speakers to staff of the faculties of education who were on panels, and to teachers who actually ran methodology workshops on teaching the Holodomor. What I wanted to stress was the fact that 65% of the attendees were of non-Ukrainian background. And of course, you can't have the Holodomor being taught without having teaching materials, resources. And this is my book, Holodomor in Ukraine, The Genocidal Famine 1932-1933, Learning Activities for Teachers and Students. It consists of 309 pages. And I say it is a generic approach because it is suitable to all standards and educational expectations. The teachers know what they are because they're very similar all over North America. In my book, the main focus is to develop critical and historical thinking skills, which is what the ministries of education are asking for. And I believe it has everything a teacher would need to teach the subject. Now, as you can see, I've tried to put in illustrations. There are timelines, as you can see, even with illustrated. There are teaching materials, there are lesson plans, a whole list of resources, etc. So it's a lot of stuff for teachers to be able to get something out of. Next. The dedication page I wanted to show you, first of all, to my parents, and also to the victims who were starved to death and could not speak for themselves, and also to an American professor, James Mace, and researcher, who worked with Robert Conquest on the US Commission on the Ukraine Famine, and with Robert Conquest on his book called The Harvest of Sorrow. It was Mace who rekindled the memory of the Holodomor's lost history and pioneered its further study in Ukraine. And one of the final things I wanted to mention was our HREC education website resource, as you can see. It is popular with educators. We have one other thing that has just come up is a new directory of Holodomor photos now online. And one American colleague, Alana Babi, was involved. She was coordinating all this work on these, the verification of these historical photographs. So HREC Ed basic information, teaching materials, lesson plans, a collection of resources for educators are all online, and you can see the address to our website. Next. And I also wanted to mention the memorandum of agreement that was signed between HREC Education, myself, and HREC in Ukraine, which is an affiliate of HREC, and the Ministry of Education in Ukraine, the lady in the middle, to create a year-round methodology lab. It was signed in 2016, and it encourages the teaching of the Holodomor using interactive and creative strategies. Strategies for teaching the Holodomor. Because of this agreement, we run 4 symposiums a year and a 2-week summer course in August for 35 educators on teaching the Holodomor, during which they have to produce a Holodomor lesson plan as well, and I am heavily involved with that. Other initiatives. April is Genocide Remembrance, Condemnation, Prevention, and Education Month. So working with other genocide community groups to include government-sponsored genocide courses to be taught in curriculum is an important factor. Working together means we have more strength to get recognized genocides like the Holocaust, Armenian, Rwanda, and the Holodomor, to push for a sponsored genocide course. Other initiatives to consider other production of more digitized teaching materials, online webinars, graphic novels. Also, I would be interested in translating teaching materials into other languages, which are prevalent locally. For example, in French in Canada, and in Spanish in the United States. A lot has been done, but a lot more needs to be done. There are still deniers out there who want to cover up the Holodomor and other genocides, and people who want to ignore it, pretend it doesn't happen, or who are not interested in human rights. But we still have to stand up and be heard in all of these pathways in order to succeed. I wanted to finish with James Mace's quote. I remain convinced that for Stalin to have complete centralized power in his hands, he found it necessary to physically destroy the second largest Soviet republic, meaning the annihilation of the Ukrainian peasantry, Ukrainian intelligentsia, Ukrainian language and history as understood by the people, to do away with Ukraine and things Ukrainian as such. The calculation was very simple, very primitive. No people, therefore no separate country, and thus no problem. Such a policy is genocide in the classic sense of the word. Each community that has experienced genocide has their own memories. The circumstances under which each tragedy came to be may be different. The method of destruction could be different, but the results are the same. The dehumanization of targeted group of people in society and their destruction that leaves consequences for generations. History has shown us that genocides can occur anywhere, even though they mostly have been prevalent in totalitarian regimes. To prevent their recurrence requires vigilance and an understanding of how genocides evolve. That is why we, as educators, have an obligation to teach our students the steps leading to genocide and provide them with tools to prevent its escalation and denial. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I have been working on the Holodomor and its teaching for over 15 years. As you can see, one has to have a passion to do this kind of work and right the wrong, such as the erasure of the Holodomor from human consciousness. It is important that this work continues, as many more things can be done, and I hope will be done. I leave you with a quote that I hold dear for you to consider. I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do. Thank you. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Oh, thank you, Valentina. That was a wonderful presentation. So if you have questions for Valentina about her presentation or her family, if she's graciously willing to answer questions, you can put them in the chat on the side and we'll get them to her. And I guess I'll start off, Valentina, with a question for you. How did you learn about the Holodomor? Was it through your family? Did you talk about it in school growing up? Yeah.
It was through my family. I have known about the Holodomor and Stalin. When parents sometimes want to threaten you that if you're not good, you're some, a witch or something. My threat was Stalin. I was told that he practically eats kids alive by my mother. That kind of feeling that this was a terrible thing that happened to them and this is what happened. He destroyed so many children. So that was one thing. I also grew up in a parish in Montreal, Quebec, where went to Canada in 1950. And all the parishioners of this parish were Holodomor survivors. And so there was no way that I could not know about it. And even before a lot of other people were commemorating, these people were commemorating. And I grew up with their pains and their suffering. And so that was something that I knew about from the time I could remember.
Thank you. We're getting quite a few questions here. One question from Nicholas asks, what's the best thing to say to deniers or apologists of this genocide?
About this genocide?
Mm-hmm.
Is it humane to starve people to death? I mean, basically, you're talking about human rights. You know, we talk about the things that we need: shelter, food. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Why would you do this to anybody, to starve anybody? We have food banks. We have all kinds of things for people who can't help themselves. Here, a government actually created the circumstances and did what they did. How could anybody be interested in promoting something like that?
Yeah. Nina asks, when did they start talking about the Holodomor in Ukraine?
In Ukraine? Well, you know, it was interesting. When Ukraine became independent, I was part of a group of teachers who went to Ukraine to help reform their education system, their manner of teaching. I mean, having one truth and everything commanded and so forth. So I had to create a course on teaching history, which was, you know, very much a politicized type of thing. And basically, I found that the teachers who were there in my classes, I started in 1993, and I taught till 2007 in various centers of Ukraine. I always found that the teachers did not know this. Very few of them came forth and said, my grandmother told me about it. So that this was something that they didn't know. And there was a film produced by the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, the first one on the documentary on the Holodomor, Harvest of Despair. I had that in Ukrainian, and I would show it during my courses, and they wept. Most of them didn't know, or most of them didn't know, or if they did know, they still wept anyway. And they realized how serious this was. So that what happened is, you know, there were various governments in Ukraine, and some of them reverted back to the Soviet ways, like Yanukovych. Therefore, you know, at that time, the Holodomor was not, you know, it was a Soviet genocide, happened everywhere. It was not specifically a genocide for Ukrainians, you know, that sort of thing. So they were saying. So I would say that in 2006, Viktor Yushchenko, the president of Ukraine at the time, he passed a law and a resolution that it was a genocide. And that's when it became more recognized, and it started being taught in schools. But I did visit Donbass, you know, where the war is on. I was, would you believe, smuggled into this institute for the professional development of teachers when the director was away. And they gave me, I was there for a week to teach about teaching using other methodologies. So I was teaching critical thinking skills, and I showed them the film. So things like that were happening, and most of them found it very difficult to accept at the beginning, because it's like saying that everything you've learned is was not true.
Wow.
So that Ukrainians are still coming to terms with that. And I would say that the war that's going on there, a lot of people say, well, some of them are, you know, they're Ukrainian speakers, they're Russian speakers. There are Ukrainians who were Russian speakers because they were forced to go to Russian schools. And when they started reading, I have to admit that there was a professor who came from the United States, Boris Subtelny, who wrote a history of Ukraine. And it was translated into many languages, and especially into Ukrainian and also Russian. So even these Russian speakers in Ukraine who read that book realized how they had been duped into accepting a history that, where they lost their historical method and memory. And I believe that a lot of these people that are now in the army and are fighting for Ukraine's liberation from the Russian troops that are in the Donbass today are converts as a result of this book.
Wow.
And the Holodomor. So it's a very important element.
Victor asks, you mentioned using art as a vehicle for teaching the Holodomor, sorry. Can you give an example of how this can be done?
Well, in my book, I have an art lesson, believe it or not, created by a friend of mine who's an excellent educator, Holodomor, and she uses art as a means through the eyes of children, she says. So she teaches it, and then she has students draw. There are pictures in my book. We have examples of their drawings that they've done, and she has a whole methodology that she describes of how to do this. And that's possible. I mean, there are lots of posters now have come out about the Holodomor as well. That could be used very easily for people to analyze. Why is somebody, there's one with that I remember that I saw of Stalin beating a drum with the bones of people. You know, Stalin's destroying the Ukrainian population, that sort of thing. So you can get kids to analyze a lot of this stuff too. So that's one thing that can happen. And kids like to draw. If they are given information about something and they are asked to imagine. By the way, this Holodomor wrote a poem based on the paintings that the kids wrote. And it's in my book as well. And it's very simplistic, but it tells the story of the Holodomor.
There was a question actually about the book. Is it available digitally?
Not yet, not yet. I just published it in 2018. It took me 10 years to do. So I thought I would try to see if I could sell a few of them. And it's CIUS Press. It goes to the university. You know, the funding goes to the university. So it will be digitized eventually. And it's being translated into Ukrainian as we speak. And I'm also planning on translating into French for Canada, of course.
Fantastic.
And that will be digitized eventually as well.
Yeah, great. There's a few questions here coming in about trying to get teachers engaged with teaching about the genocide in classrooms. Has it been well received? Is there pushback from administrators or teachers? What does that look like?
Well, I'm finding it's moving. It's growing all the time. Last week I found out about a teacher in Nanaimo, British Columbia. This is on Vancouver Island, on the tip. It's a way out place. It's a small city. And this teacher joined a group of, I think it's called Genocide Prevention, BC, because she wanted to teach she was asked to teach the genocide course, and she decided she had to learn more. So what she did was she joined this group, and when she was in this group, people were talking about why they were in the group. And my sister, who lives in Vancouver, she talked about our family history, and this woman was so enthralled with the story. She ended up connecting with me. I gave her information. She taught the Holodomor already. She has written an article to the BC Teachers Magazine, and she started a project in which they are planting trees. And when they plant these little trees, they have a park in the city that was designated for the high school. They're planting trees. They also put a big stone, and using paint, they write about they wrote, for example, Armenian genocide, another stone and another tree for the Rwandan, another one for the Holocaust, another one for the Holodomor. And so they have these kids looking after these trees, and it made a big impression on the whole community and the whole city. And she sent me the article, and I'm sending it out to a lot of people, you know, and this has nothing to do with, I mean, it's based on the work we've been doing, obviously, because we have the resources. I've sent her resources and everything. But the point is that the word is getting out, and people who don't know are interested in finding out. And because we do have a website and we have all this information, the word is getting out, and it's much easier than it used to be. When I started, I just have to tell you, I said, I'm using the word Holodomor. There were all kinds of researchers who told me, what are you doing? Nobody knows what it means. Nobody's going to understand. Why are you doing this? I said, well, I'm sure the Holocaust, when they started using the word Holocaust, nobody knew what it meant. But it has made a mark, and it has a meaning. And I'm happy to say that in this 15 years, I don't have to explain it. Usually people know. And if they don't, they're embarrassed that they don't. And so that's a good thing. But we do have deniers as well. There was an incident at the University of Alberta by one of the staff, by the way. And that made a big, big commotion for our community and at the university itself. That's right. That who denied it and said it was all lies. So there are people, including professors and all kinds of people. There are socialists that still don't want to question the socialist utopia and what it did.
As a follow-up question, is the genocide being taught in Western Europe?
I'm not too familiar with that. I know in France there have been books that have come out. There was a graphic novel on the Holodomor. And I know, I'm not sure if it's part of a regular curriculum. That is something I'll have to find out. I'm not sure about that. In Ukraine, it is being taught. It is now part and parcel, of course, of the curriculum in several grades. And they have a special course on the Holodomor that students take. I think it's in the grade 10 course, grade 10 course that they have for 35 hours in the year on it, as well as one on the Holocaust, by the way, which is also good. Yeah.
Joseph's wondering about your classmates in your kindergarten picture. Do you know what happened to any of them?
Not really. The only person in that picture that I remember is one of the teachers. She ended up being, she and her husband were in the same refugee camp. They went to Montreal as well. I've known them for many years. And I ended up being the executor of her estate. That kind of closeness with my parents. They were very close with my parents. But the other people, everybody went to different areas. Some went to Australia, some went to the United States, others came to Canada, as refugees, as DPs, as they called us.
And related to that, has there been an effort in Canada to collect survivor testimonies, stories, and are those available publicly?
Yes, they are. I mentioned the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. They have an oral history collection, and they have an excellent collection of Holodomor survivor accounts. And what they've done is they've used little segments of the interviews. They put them on the web, and it's called Share the Story. And you can go onto the web and find it. You can see that the link in my book and on our website, and they have a website as well. And it's called Share the Story. I can't remember if it's .com or .ca. And you can get little excerpts from it, and I use it in my teaching as well. And you can get the kids to analyze. So you can get, let's say, 5 or 6 of these and get the kids to pick out what is the Holodomor all about from the memoirs or from the survivor accounts, as most of these people were children at the time. So it's not a political issue. It's basically your daily life and how it was affected by what was happening and what was happening. So we do have that. So we do have the oral history. And we also have a program called Children of Survivors Speak, of Holodomor Survivors Speak. So we've been collecting that as well, because as you know, probably from Holocaust studies, that the influence of a genocide does not end with the survivors. It goes on for at least 3 generations, if not more, both psychological, physical manifestations and so forth. So this is very important, and we're still collecting the memoirs of children of survivors. Very few of our survivors are still with us. We have one gentleman who is a real trooper, Mr. Latishko in Toronto. He was 8 years old at the time, and he has written books, and he has poetry that he has written about the Holodomor as well. And some of it has been translated into English. But we do have this collection at the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, which I recommend for teachers to use and for the general public. And what they have is that these little transcripts, I forgot to mention, they have transcripts of what they say, and they're short. And it's in English and Ukrainian as well, and French. So they're readily available. And that's and the language is simplistic because there were children at the time. So it's easy to read. And so children can actually use them very easily.
And I think on that note too, I'll just mention that the University of Minnesota archives now have a collection of survivor testimony. I think Luda, maybe you can talk a little bit about this if you're able, that there are just a handful of survivors left in Minnesota that have had their stories preserved, and then the children and grandchildren. And I'll put a link to our archives here in the chat for everyone. And Luda, if you want to mention anything about the project here.
Yes, last year, the Ukrainian Center sponsored project led by Zina Politz-Gutman, is one of our community activists who collected stories of Holodomor, their children and grandchildren, and there are a couple of Holodomor survivors themselves who were children during the Holodomor. And actually, and then as mentioned Joe, they are now preserved at the Anderson Library at the University of Minnesota, and were recently digitized and published on the CHDS website. And so that's the link that Joe is sharing with you. Very moving. Discovered a new survivor who survived both Holodomor and Holocaust. And we just interviewed her recently. Didn't have chance yet to publish her accounts, but yeah, so this is very important work. And also, as far as I know, Zina continues work on that, and she is planning to do a documentary based on those accounts of Holodomor survivors in Minnesota, here in Minnesota. So we are very proud and very excited about this project.
I just wanted to mention that Zina approached my assistant, Sofia Isaev, who was working as on the children of survivors speaking in Toronto, to come and speak to her and to sort of talk about what we had done at the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. So that we've had a little bit of cooperation there. So that's very nice that we were able to get together on that.
Absolutely.
And I think we should be doing a lot more of that, because what's the point of reinventing a wheel if you can get some information and get started on it a lot faster? And I think with the work that, from what Sophia tells me, the work was wonderful that was done.
A couple of people are asking about what your adjustment was like coming from the camp in Germany to now Montreal. How did you adapt? How did you settle in?
Well, I was 4.5, quite young. Well, the language issue, I think, was the biggest worry at the time. It was, we ended up in French Canada. We didn't know English, nor did we know French. And by the way they were setting up their education system, you had to go based on religion into a school. So not being a Catholic, I was Orthodox. I ended up in the Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal. We were sort of, you know, but the language I learned very quickly. You know, it was a difficult time because in the 50s, when all the men came home from the war, there were very few jobs. So my father had to, you know, he had difficulty finding a job, even though he had his papers as a mechanic. But when he got his first job, some of the French Canadians were very angry. There was discrimination against someone coming in and taking a job that they felt should be given to a French Canadian. So my father left that position and went to do hard labor instead. So there was that kind of discrimination against the new wave of immigrants that we've experienced. So that was, and we got beaten up a couple. I lived in the slums of Montreal, I have to tell you. I grew up there, which my students would never wanted to believe whenever I mentioned something like that. But anyway, you had to learn, you had to have street smarts to be able to survive in that kind of thing as a child.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps. My parents never learned either language very well. They learned a smattering of English, but because there were two languages, they did not learn French. So I ended up being a translator at a very early age.
Hmm. Yeah, it's something that Luda mentioned, our Bridges of Memory project, and that's something we hear about this kind of balancing act between different cultures that often the children face.
Yes.
We have a couple of questions about the vandalism that you talked about in your presentation on Canada Day. And do you know who's committing this vandalism, either here or back in Ukraine?
We don't know. I mean, you can surmise who it is. I mean, in Ukraine, it would be, you know, those who are against Ukrainian independence and the revival of the Soviet Union, the past glory. There are lots of trolls. Putin has his people out there. There's no question of it. And so it doesn't take much. I actually saw a monument to Ukrainian heroes during World War II defaced when I was in Kharkiv, for example. That was a number of years ago. They just put the monument up, and within the next day, there was a red paint all over it, which I witnessed, which is very real. And the one in Canada, well, they don't know why, and they don't know who, but there's an investigation going. If that's going to help, I don't know. But this tribute to liberty and the victims of communism, you know, people have been giving money to set up. It's going to be, this is just a placing for the monument. The monument is not there as yet, as it's going to stand. And it's a place that is being kept. But the community has been, a lot of people, not just the Ukrainian community, anybody who wants to sort of, they want the names of people who had suffered under the communist regime. So for $1,000, you can have a brick. You can put money into it. So I did that for my parents.
Another question about history. Why and how did the Holodomor end?
Okay. The worst part was the 7 months of 1933, okay? The height of the famine was in June 1933, because by that time, if anybody had any food, everything was gone. There was still nothing growing to eat. And by that time, death was imminent. But also you had to have planting. And the Soviets had made lots of money to buy industrial machines to pay for their industrialization of the Soviet Union using Ukrainian grain. Therefore, they had to sow a crop. And so they opened the granaries. They had granaries that had wheat in them. And they opened the granaries and they started giving out food. According to demographers, at least 500,000, 500,000 people died in 1934 because they were too far gone. But some of the people were able to get food, and that's how it ended, in that sense.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Richard's wondering, he has grandchildren in the Ottawa area who are in grade school and high school, and wondering, what's the likelihood of them learning about the genocide in their classroom?
Well, I know that it's in the grade 10 history class, his history course, when they deal with human rights and abuses. The Holocaust is there, and the Armenian and the Holodomor is mentioned too. So in grade 10, unless the teacher is going to be very selective, they should be able to hear about it. It's also in a number of, in the political science course that is run. I know that for a fact too, and in the history program as well, in the grade 12 history. And in the elementary panel where they talk about human rights, it's something that a teacher can do without having to even have it mentioned, whether you want to choose the Holocaust, the Armenian, or do a number of them. So the chances are that it could be taught. And I was teaching at a Ukrainian school on a Saturday. And I used to tell my high school students in that Ukrainian school, I said, if you're doing a project, tell your teacher you want to do it on the Holodomor. And one boy came back, and his name was Patton, with an English name. The teacher was quite shocked. His mother was Ukrainian. But anyway, so he came back to me and says, my teacher said it never happened, and there are no resources. So I gave him the books. And I told him, I said, and tell your teacher that your Saturday school teacher teaching history is a department head of history with the Toronto District School Board. And that did it.
Have you seen it spread more through the Canadian schools? Is it more prevalent? Is it still continuing to grow?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. As I said, it's in those 6 provinces that have recognized it. The only one that I really haven't had much to do with so far is Quebec. They recognized it unanimously as a genocide, and they have a day for memorials. But I've just started translating stuff into French. You cannot go to Quebec and speak to the Ministry of Education without French materials. And I used to speak French reasonably well, but I've lost a lot of it because I've been living in Ontario for so many years and I haven't been using it. So I would need it. I would ask for a translator because I wouldn't want to, say something that's not correct.
Well, I think we have covered just about all the questions. Valentina, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Luda, I want to give you an opportunity to say any closing remarks.
Thank you so much on behalf of the Ukrainian Center, to the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Study, to Joe, to you, and to Valentina. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. We enjoyed having you with us tonight, and I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everybody. It's deep felt, heartfelt thank you. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Oh, thank you. And this will be put up on our YouTube channel within a week or so. So thank you so much again, everyone, for coming. And Valentina, thank you.
You're welcome. Very welcome.
Good night.
Good night.